A widow marries her own son. Truth or twisted rumour? Welcome to Midnight Radio Drama. I am your host, Wilfred. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your comments keep this mystery alive. I can't wait to read them. Let's begin. The annual Flaxborough Garden Gala was well underway, as unassuming and predictable as the town's weather, which on this particular June afternoon was a muted affair. Grey skies veiling a gentle drizzle that barely disturbed the neatly manicured flower beds. At the heart of the village green, clusters of polite townsfolk moved among the stalls, exchanging measured greetings and whispers about begonias, petunias, and the merits of organic compost. Inspector Purbright, attired in his habitual tweed and bowler, stood by the refreshments tent, surveying the scene with the detached interest of a man who preferred to listen rather than dominate. The steady murmur of conversation was punctuated by the occasional clink of china and the polite laughter of ladies in floral hats that had seen better days. The occasion was quintessential Flaxborough, pleasant, uneventful, and orderly. Until a small but unmistakably odd incident fractured the day's gentle rhythm. At precisely 2:15, a shrill scream pierced the subdued chatter. Heads turned toward the central marquee, where Mrs. Edith Langley, the widow of the recently deceased Major Langley, stood trembling, clutching her handbag with a white-knuckled grip. Beside her, a young man, her son, Henry, looked equally shaken, though with a practiced restraint. "It's gone! The necklace! Gone!" Edith gasped, voice quavering, with a mixture of shock and outrage. "My late husband's mourning pearls vanished from my stand!" The widow's display had been a modest one, an assortment of antique jewellery and trinkets donated for auction to raise funds for the local church restoration. The missing pearls were the centerpiece, a family heirloom reputedly once worn by a scandalous ancestor in a long-forgotten affair. Their absence was more than just a loss of value. It was a public affront to reputation. The crowd gathered quickly, murmuring and exchanging glances. Among them, Clara Redmond, a local historian with a sharp eye and an often sharper tongue, whispered to a companion, "It seems even in mourning the Langleys attract their share of trouble." Nearby, Mr. Samuel Holt, a newcomer whose presence had already ruffled feathers among the town's established families, watched with a guarded expression, his fingers tapping an impatient rhythm on the rim of his teacup. Inspector Purbright stepped forward, offering a calm and courteous presence. "Mrs. Langley, may I assure you that we shall treat this matter with the utmost seriousness? May I ask when you last saw the necklace?" Edith straightened, summoning what dignity she could. "Only moments ago, when I arranged the display. I turned away briefly to speak with Mrs. Parsons, and when I returned, the pearls were gone." "Were there many visitors near your stall in that time?" Purbright inquired. The widow hesitated, then nodded. "Quite a few, but no one seemed suspicious. Although Mr. Davies, the florist, did linger longer than necessary." A ripple of interest passed through the bystanders, and Purbright made a discreet note. Thus began a day that promised, to the outside observer, little more than a misplaced piece of jewellery. Yet in Flaxborough, even a missing necklace could unravel the carefully woven fabric of social grace and hidden tensions, as the inspector quietly prepared to delve beneath the surface of polite façades and into the heart of the town's concealed dramas. The delicate murmur of the garden gala persisted in the background, though a subtle tension had settled over the green like a fine mist. Inspector Purbright lingered near Mrs. Langley's stall, his gaze sweeping unobtrusively over the faces that hovered like anxious moths around the missing pearls. The widow herself stood with a mixture of indignation and unease, her eyes darting toward her son Henry, whose usual composure now seemed slightly fractured. There was something in the young man's posture, an edge of nervous impatience beneath the polite exterior, that caught Purbright's practised attention. "Mr. Davies did linger a while," Edith repeated, nodding toward the florist's stall not far away, where a stout, ruddy-faced man was busy arranging dahlias. "He's always been a bit too familiar, if you ask me." Purbright inclined his head. "We shall speak with Mr. Davies shortly. But first, Mrs. Langley, you mentioned you were speaking with Mrs. Parsons. May I ask about her?" "Ah, yes," Edith replied, somewhat hesitantly. "Emily Parsons is a long-standing friend, a woman of impeccable reputation. She was assisting with the auction arrangements. I believe she was nearby when the necklace disappeared." The inspector nodded and turned his attention across the crowd, spotting Emily Parsons engaged in conversation with Clara Redmond, whose keen eyes flicked toward the Langley stall with evident curiosity. Purbright approached them with a courteous smile. "Miss Parsons, may I impose upon you a few moments?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Emily regarded him with a calm grace. "Of course, Inspector. Anything to assist?" "As you were near Mrs. Langley's stall at the time of the disappearance, did you notice anything unusual? Any strangers or peculiar behavior?" Emily's brows furrowed slightly. "Unusual is relative in Flaxborough, Inspector, but I did observe Mr. Davies lingering longer than necessary, as Mrs. Langley suggested. Additionally, I noticed Henry seemed distracted, almost preoccupied." Purbright filed this detail away discreetly. "Thank you, Miss Parsons. Your observations are most helpful." Nearby, Samuel Holt observed the exchange with an inscrutable expression, his arms crossed. The newcomer's ambition was whispered about in town halls and tea-rooms alike, and his interest in the missing pearls seemed more calculated than incidental. Purbright's next step was to interview Mr. Davies himself. The florist, wiping soil from his hands, looked momentarily taken aback by the inspector's approach. "Mr. Davies, I'm investigating the disappearance of a necklace at the gala. Mrs. Langley suggested you may have been near the stall when it vanished." Davies cleared his throat, a flicker of defensiveness crossing his face. "I did linger, yes, but only to admire the flowers on display, nothing more." Purbright observed the man's tone and posture with care. "You wouldn't say you had any quarrel with Mrs. Langley?" The florist's mouth tightened. "Quarrel? No, but one can't deny the widow's influence in town. Sometimes it feels as if her family owns the place." An intriguing hint of resentment, but no direct accusation. Later, Purbright found himself considering the Langley family's social position. The Major's recent death had left Edith in control of a modest estate and a reputation that was more fragile than it appeared. Her son Henry, a man with ambitions restrained by circumstance, seemed caught between loyalty and restlessness. That evening at the Rose and Crown, Purbright met once again with Clara Redmond and Emily Parsons. The atmosphere was congenial, yet underpinned by the ever-present undercurrent of social manoeuvring. Clara remarked, "The pearls are more than jewellery, Inspector. They carry history, scandal, and apparently power." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes it's the smallest tokens that reveal the largest fractures." Purbright sipped his tea, allowing their words to settle. The investigation was far from straightforward. Behind the missing necklace lay whispers of grudges, ambitions, and hidden alliances. Each interview added another layer of complexity, and he was beginning to see how the town's quiet order was delicately balanced on a knife edge. The days ahead promised further revelations as the subtle dance of suspicion and truth unfolded beneath Flaxborough's polite veneer. Flaxborough had settled into a tentative calm after the initial stir caused by the missing pearls, yet beneath the surface currents of gossip and speculation flowed steadily. At the town's modest police station, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, sifting through his notes with the deliberate patience that had earned him his reputation. The modest spill of afternoon light through the window illuminated a series of careful observations, timings, alibis, and the subtle tensions he had detected among those connected to the Langley family. Henry Langley was the first to return for a more formal conversation. The young man appeared somewhat more composed than during the garden gala, but retained a certain guardedness. His crisp jacket and careful grooming spoke of an awareness of public perception, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of restlessness. "Mr. Langley," Purbright began gently, "I appreciate your cooperation. I'd like to understand your movements during the event more precisely." Henry nodded, a slight tension in his jaw. "Certainly, Inspector. I was attending to our stall for most of the afternoon, greeting guests and assisting my mother." "Was there anyone in particular who engaged your attention? Any unusual visitors?" Henry hesitated, then admitted, "I did notice Mr. Holt approaching several times. He seems keen to establish connections with the more established families." Purbright made a note, then asked, "And your relationship with your mother, Mrs. Edith Langley, is it cordial?" A faint smile curved Henry's lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We have our differences, Inspector. She can be exacting, but I respect her." The inspector's gaze lingered a moment longer before shifting to the question of the pearls. "Have you any idea who might want to take them?" Henry shook his head slowly. "It's difficult to say. In Flaxborough, reputations are precious. Perhaps someone sought to unsettle my mother or to send a message." The possibility hung between them, as tangible as the fog beginning to thicken outside. Next, Purbright turned his attention to Samuel Holt. The newcomer had swiftly become a figure of interest, not least because of his business ambitions and a certain urbane confidence that set him apart from the town's usual rhythms. Holt was seated comfortably in the station's modest interview room, his demeanour composed, but not without an undercurrent of guardedness. "Mr. Holt," Purbright began, "your presence at the garden gala was noted, as was your interest in the Langley stall. Can you tell me about that?" Holt inclined his head with the practised ease of a man used to scrutiny. "I believe in acquainting myself with the community's traditions, Inspector. The Langley family is well regarded, and the pearls have their stories." "Stories that might motivate theft?" Purbright asked gently. Holt smiled thinly. "I would hope not. But every community has its tensions. My business ventures have not been universally welcomed, it seems." A flash of bitterness crossed his features before he masked it. "I have no interest in petty theft, Inspector." Purbright made a quiet mental note of Holt's defensiveness, understanding that in small towns ambition often bred as much suspicion as admiration. The afternoon brought Purbright to visit the florist, Mr. Davies, whose stall was fragrant with roses and lilacs. The man greeted him with a wary smile, his hands stained with soil. "I hear you've had some questions about the missing pearls," Davies said, wiping them on his apron. "Yes, Mr. Davies, you were mentioned as lingering near Mrs. Langley's stall. Care to explain?" Davies shrugged. "I was admiring the craftsmanship, that's all. But truth be told, I've long resented the Langleys' influence. Feels like they look down on us common folk." His frankness was notable, yet he denied any involvement. "I wouldn't stoop to theft. Too much risk." Purbright accepted this with cautious skepticism, aware that resentment could be both a motive and a misdirection. As dusk approached, Purbright convened with Clara Redmond, whose keen knowledge of Flaxborough's history often provided valuable context. Over tea in the town's modest library, Clara mused on the nature of the pearls and their symbolism. "The mourning pearls belonged to the late Major Langley's great-grandmother," she explained. "A woman known for her scandalous love affairs and daring independence. The pearls symbolize both grief and defiance." "Interesting," Purbright replied. "So their disappearance might carry a symbolic message." "Indeed. Perhaps a challenge to the widow's authority, or a reminder of the past's shadow over the present." The inspector pondered this as he left the library, the weight of history settling on his shoulders. Flaxborough was not merely a town of gardens and gossip. It was a place where past and present intermingled, where secrets lingered in the shadows of polite society. That evening, a second disturbance rippled through the town. A letter, anonymous and terse, delivered to the editor of the Flaxborough Gazette, hinted at truths best left buried regarding the Langley family and the missing pearls. The editor, Mrs. Beatrice Carmichael, was visibly unsettled when Purbright arrived to discuss the matter. "This letter," she said, has caused quite a stir. It suggests that the pearls are merely the surface of a deeper secret." Purbright listened intently, aware that the game had just deepened. As night fell over Flaxborough, the inspector retired with a sense of cautious anticipation. The town's quiet order was fraying, and he could sense that the coming days would reveal the tangled motives beneath the serene surface. The morning sun broke weakly through a veil of mist, casting a muted glow over Flaxborough as the town stirred to life with its usual measured pace. Yet beneath the placid surface, Inspector Purbright sensed a subtle shift in the air, a tension that had settled like dust in the corners of the village square, refusing to be swept away by polite chatter or the customary nods exchanged at the baker's and the butcher's. The anonymous letter delivered to the Flaxborough Gazette the previous evening had set tongues wagging, and Purbright was keenly aware that a discreet approach was required. His first call of the day was to Mrs. Beatrice Carmichael, the editor, who greeted him in her cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of newspapers and fading photographs. "Inspector," she said, folding the letter carefully, "this note is causing more than a little unease. The references are vague but pointed, hinting at scandals long whispered about but never quite voiced." Purbright gave a measured nod. "Has anyone come forward since its arrival?" Beatrice shook her head. "No one official, but there are whispers. Some old families feel their reputations are under threat, while others see an opportunity to settle scores." As Purbright made his way out, he noted the subdued but telling glances exchanged by passers-by, a silent testament to the town's readiness to listen to rumours that offered an escape from mundane routine. His next visit was to Mrs. Edith Langley's residence, a weathered but stately house on the edge of the village. Edith received him in the drawing-room, her posture poised, though shadows of fatigue marked her features. "Inspector, I must admit this whole affair is distressing," she said softly, offering a trembling handkerchief. "I find myself wondering not just about the pearls, but about what else might surface." Purbright chose his words carefully. "Mrs. Langley, do you have any suspicions about the letter's author or their intent?" She hesitated. "There are old grievances, old wounds that never quite healed. But to see them so publicly aired—" Her voice trailed off as if the thought alone was unsettling. Noting her unease, Purbright pressed gently. "Has your family experienced any recent conflicts or disagreements?" Edith's eyes flickered. "My late husband's business affairs left some unsettled matters. Henry and I have had our differences on how to proceed, but nothing that would warrant such public insinuations." As Purbright left, he was struck by the complexity of loyalties and resentments entwined in the Langley household. The pearls, once a symbol of mourning, had become a prism refracting old tensions and new ambitions. Later that afternoon, Purbright sought out Henry Langley, who was found at the town's modest railway station, pacing near the ticket office. The young man's face was pale, the strain of the past days evident in the set of his jaw. "Inspector?" Henry greeted him with a faint nod. "It seems the past has a way of catching up." Purbright observed the man's posture, the nervous tapping of fingers on his coat sleeve. "Mr. Langley, this letter, does it implicate you or your family directly?" Henry shook his head. "Not explicitly, but the innuendo is unmistakable. It suggests secrets that could damage our standing. I fear it will unsettle more than just the Langley name." "Have you considered who might benefit from such disruption?" Henry's gaze darkened momentarily. "There are rivals, old business associates who felt wronged, and then there are those within the town who see the Langleys as a relic to be eclipsed." Purbright made a mental note to explore these angles further, sensing that the landscape of grievances extended beyond personal rivalry. That evening, Purbright convened with Clara Redmond and Emily Parsons at the Rose and Crown. The familiar setting offered a refuge from the day's tensions, yet the conversation turned inevitably to the mysteries unfolding. Clara, with her characteristic sharpness, remarked, "The anonymous letter is a catalyst. It stirs up the sediment beneath the town's placid surface." Emily nodded. "And it forces the town to confront its contradictions, respectability and scandal, loyalty and betrayal." Purbright sipped his tea thoughtfully. "The pearls were the spark, but the flame now burns deeper. We must be vigilant for what lies beneath." As night deepened, the inspector's thoughts turned inward. Flaxborough, with its quiet streets and polite façades, was a repository of human complexity, a place where history and ambition wove together in a tapestry of concealed motives. The coming days would require patience and acuity to unravel the threads without disturbing the delicate balance too abruptly. The missing pearls, the whispered threats, and the careful manoeuvring of its inhabitants had transformed the town's garden gala into a stage for a more subtle drama, one that would demand all of Purbright's skill to resolve. The morning after the evening's unsettling conversation found Flaxborough cloaked in a gentle drizzle, the grey skies matching the subdued mood that seemed to permeate the town. Inspector Purbright moved deliberately through the streets, noting the slight drop in the usual chatter at the marketplace and the guarded glances exchanged in the lanes. The anonymous letter had shifted the atmosphere. It was no longer merely a mystery about missing pearls, but a whisper of deeper, more tangled secrets. His first appointment was with Mrs. Beatrice Carmichael at the Flaxborough Gazette office. The editor greeted him with a mixture of relief and concern. "Inspector, since the letter was published, there have been several calls from people wishing to remain anonymous. Each seems to add a layer to the story, but none offer solid proof." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Rumour is a double-edged sword, informative and dangerous. Have you noticed any particular themes in these communications?" Beatrice sifted through a small pile of letters. "Most point to the Langley family's past business dealings, old debts, betrayals and whispered scandals. Others mention a long-standing feud between the Langleys and some local tradespeople. That might explain the bitterness from Mr. Davies, the florist." Purbright mused aloud. "Yes, his name came up again. He's said to harbour resentments about the Langleys' influence." Before leaving, Purbright asked, "Has anyone threatened harm or direct confrontation?" Beatrice hesitated. "Nothing explicit, but there was a veiled comment about justice catching up with those who hide behind wealth. It has unsettled many." From the Gazette office, Purbright proceeded to the modest home of Samuel Holt, whose business ambitions had become a topic of whispered speculation. The man was in his study when Purbright arrived, an aura of calm self-assurance cloaking a simmering tension. "Mr. Holt," Purbright began, "this anonymous letter seems to hint at grievances involving the Langley family." Do you have any knowledge of such disputes that might be relevant? Holt steepled his fingers, eyes narrowing slightly. Flaxborough is a town of history and tradition, Inspector. Every family carries burdens, some more burdensome than others. I have had my share of challenges with the established order, certainly, but I have no desire to inflame matters unnecessarily. Purbright's gaze lingered. Would you say your ambitions have caused friction? Perhaps, Holt admitted, but I prefer progress to rancour. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock, and Henry Langley was shown in, his expression tense. Inspector, Henry began, Mr. Holt and I have had our disagreements, but we share a common interest in preserving the town's well-being. Holt inclined his head, though his eyes remained sharp. Indeed, and the Pearl's disappearance is a blow to us all. Purbright observed the subtle dance of civility and undercurrents of rivalry playing out before him. The fragile social fabric of Flaxborough was being stretched taut. Later that afternoon, Purbright made his way to the Langley estate, where Edith Langley was waiting in the drawing-room. The room was heavy with the scent of lavender and old wood, and Edith's face bore the strain of sleepless nights. "Inspector, I'm beginning to wonder if the pearls were merely a symptom," she said quietly. "If the letter's threats are more than idle words, what other secrets might come to light?" Purbright nodded. "Sometimes it is the smallest fissures that allow light or darkness to enter. Have you noticed anything unusual around the house? Visitors, unfamiliar faces?" She paused. "There was a man, a solicitor's clerk, who came the day before the gala. He asked questions about the family's history and the pearls, though he gave no name." "That is a detail worth pursuing," Purbright said. As evening fell, Purbright met again with Clara Redmond and Emily Parsons at the Rose and Crown. The familiar warmth of the tavern contrasted with the chill of suspicion that had settled over the town. Clara mused. "It seems every person we speak with carries a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remains elusive." Emily nodded. "And the threads are tangled with old grievances and new ambitions. The missing pearls are a symbol, but the message is buried deeper." Purbright sipped his tea, eyes thoughtful. "Patience will be our ally. The truth often reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in the quiet details overlooked by all but the most observant." That night, as rain pattered softly against the windows of his modest lodgings, Purbright reflected on the day's discoveries. The outward calm of Flaxborough masked a web of tensions, resentments and alliances delicately balanced on the edge of revelation. The pearls had become more than a missing object. They were the catalyst for a reckoning long in the making. The inspector understood that the days ahead would require a keen eye for nuance and the patience to unravel a tale woven with subtlety and irony, much like the town itself. The morning dawned grey and unpromising, with a chill mist clinging to the hedgerows and curling through the narrow streets of Flaxborough. Inspector Purbright found the dampness a fitting backdrop for the subtle tensions that now gripped the town, a quiet unease that had spread since the mysterious letter and the stolen pearls. The case had shifted from mere theft to something far more tangled, old rivalries, whispered accusations, and the brittle veneer of civility that Flaxborough's residents wore like their Sunday best. Purbright's first visit was to the modest flower shop of Mr. Davies, the local florist, whose name had surfaced repeatedly in whispered conversations since the letter's arrival. Davies was a thin man with a hawkish nose and a perpetually furrowed brow, his hands rough from years of pruning and arranging blooms. He greeted Purbright with a guarded expression, dusting soil from his apron. "Inspector," Davies said, voice low and slightly defensive, "I've heard the rumours, but I'm no criminal. Just a man trying to make an honest living in a town that favours the well-born over the hard-working. Purbright inclined his head politely. Mr. Davies, I understand tensions have been high. It's natural for grievances to arise when old balances shift. Could you tell me about your relationship with the Langley family? Davies's eyes narrowed. It's been strained, to put it mildly. The Langleys have a way of pushing people aside if they don't serve their interests. They bought up land and undercut prices, making life difficult for local tradesfolk like myself. Would you say there's been any direct conflict recently? Purbright asked, noting the tightness around Davies's mouth. Nothing beyond the usual frustrations, Davies replied. But the pearls, they belong to Mrs. Langley. That kind of loss strikes at more than just the pocketbook. It's about respect. Purbright made a note to consider how much resentment might have fermented beneath the surface. Next, he turned his attention to the solicitor's office, where the mysterious clerk had been reported. The firm was an old establishment, its polished mahogany doors and frosted glass windows lending an air of gravitas. Inside, Purbright met Miss Agnes Carraway, the senior clerk, a woman whose keen eyes missed little. "Inspector Purbright," she greeted with formal courtesy. "I understand you wish to discuss a recent visitor to our offices." "Yes, Miss Carraway. A gentleman inquired about the Langley family's history and the pearls, but did not identify himself." Agnes's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, that was Mr. Fletcher, a junior associate. He was conducting preliminary research for a potential client. "Unfortunately, I'm unable to disclose more without instructions from Mr. Langley or his representatives." Purbright appreciated the bounds of professional discretion, but sensed something unsaid. "Is it unusual for such inquiries to be made discreetly?" Miss Carraway hesitated. "In Flaxborough, discretion is prized, but curiosity is inevitable." Leaving the solicitors, Purbright's next call was to the modest cottage of Mrs. Maud Trent, a long-time neighbour of the Langleys and a known repository of local gossip. Maud greeted him with a wary smile, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the chill. "Oh, Inspector," she began, settling into her worn armchair. "This whole affair has set the village tongues wagging like never before. They say secrets have a way of clawing out of the darkest corners." Purbright smiled gently. "Mrs. Trent, have you noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the gala? Any visitors, strange noises, or odd behaviour?" Maud nodded slowly. "There was a carriage that arrived late one evening, driven by a man who kept to the shadows. I didn't catch a name, but it wasn't someone from around here." "Did anyone else see this carriage?" "Only a few, mostly the stable hands and the night watchman, but they've been tight-lipped, nervous even." "Thank you, Mrs. Trent. Your observations are most helpful." Purbright stepped outside, the mist thickening as he walked towards the town square. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the very stones awaited revelation. His mind returned to the fragments gathered so far, the resentment of tradesfolk, the solicitor's discreet inquiries, and the enigmatic visitor cloaked in shadow. At the Rose and Crown that evening, Purbright found Clara Redmond and Emily Parsons waiting. The two women exchanged glances as he approached, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Inspector," Clara began, "the gossip mill churns relentlessly. Some suggest the pearls are merely a symbol of power, of privilege, perhaps even of hidden transgressions." Emily added, "And with every whisper, the town's façade fractures a little more. The missing pearls are less about their worth and more about what they represent." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "The pearls are a catalyst, yes, but our task is to unravel the human stories beneath." The trio fell into discussion, weaving together the strands of rivalry, ambition and fear that now defined Flaxborough's uneasy days. As the night deepened, Purbright returned to his lodgings, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows on his desk. He spread out his notes and reviewed each conversation, each observation, searching for the subtle behavioral clues, the pauses, the evasions, the small contradictions that often held the key to truth. The case was no longer about a simple theft. It was about a town's hidden fractures and the quiet battles fought behind closed doors. Purbright knew the coming days would test his patience and his powers of deduction as the truth lay buried beneath layers of civility and suppressed grievance. The dawn was reluctant to arrive, with heavy clouds lingering like an unspoken secret above Flaxborough. Inspector Purbright found himself wandering through the town's quiet streets, reflecting on the recent conversations and the slow, twisting paths the investigation had taken. The stolen pearls were no longer simply a missing treasure. They had become a lens through which the delicate web of Flaxborough's relationships was beginning to unravel. His first stop was the humble abode of Henry Langley, the young man who had earlier appeared composed, but whose eyes had betrayed a hint of unease. Henry was in his study when Purbright arrived, a room lined with leather-bound books, the scent of pipe tobacco mingling with the faint aroma of polished oak. "Inspector," Henry greeted, standing with a slight stiffness. "I trust the day finds you well." "As well as one can be in these circumstances," Purbright replied with a mild smile. "I wanted to speak further about the evening of the gala. I understand you were among the last to leave room 17? Henry nodded. "Yes, though I must confess, my memory of the exact timings is somewhat clouded by the events." "Understandable," Purbright said, sitting down. "Tell me, was there anyone whose behavior struck you as peculiar?" Henry hesitated. "There was Miss Parsons, Emily. She appeared anxious, more than one would expect for a social gathering." Purbright's interest piqued. "Anxiety can often mask other motives. Did she say anything unusual?" "Not directly," Henry said, "but I overheard fragments of conversation, words like retribution and old debts." "Old debts?" Purbright repeated softly. "Yes, a hint that not all is as peaceful beneath the surface." Their conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of the front doorbell. Henry excused himself to answer, returning shortly with Clara Redmond in tow. "Inspector, I thought it prudent to join," Clara said, her gaze steady. Purbright acknowledged her presence. "Miss Redmond, your insights have been valuable. What do you make of the tensions in Flaxborough?" Clara sighed. "It's as if the town itself is holding its breath. The Langleys are respected, yes, but there are cracks in their foundation. The missing pearls have exposed those cracks." Purbright nodded. "Cracks that run deeper than one might suspect." As the morning progressed, Purbright arranged to meet with the town's night watchman, Thomas Wilkes, a weathered man whose shifts brought him into contact with the town's shadowy corners. Wilkes was reserved but cooperative, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fatigue and vigilance. "Inspector, I recall the night of the gala quite well," Wilkes said. "I saw a carriage arrive late, just as Mrs. Trent mentioned. The driver was a man I didn't recognize. He stayed only briefly, but the way he looked around suggested he was not a visitor of good intent." "Did you see where he went?" "No, sir. He slipped away towards the northern lanes, which are less frequented." Purbright noted the detail. "Anything else unusual that night?" Wilkes shook his head. "Only the usual. But the town feels different now, as if something unseen is at work." Leaving Wilkes, Purbright wandered to the Rose and Crown once more, where a small gathering had formed, drawn by the hum of whispered theories and pointed glances. Emily Parsons was there, her posture tense as she spoke quietly, with a few townsfolk. "Miss Parsons?" Purbright began gently. "May I have a word?" She looked up, startled but composed. "Of course, Inspector." "Your anxiety the night of the gala was remarked upon. Would you care to share your thoughts?" Emily hesitated, then said, "It's difficult to speak openly. There are things in Flaxborough, secrets, that weigh heavily. I suspect some of us fear what may surface." Purbright's eyes were keen. "Fear is a powerful motivator. Have you noticed anyone acting differently since the pearls vanished?" "There is talk," Emily admitted, "of debts unpaid, grievances settled in shadows. Some names come up often, but no one is willing to speak plainly." Their conversation was interrupted by a loud crash from the tavern's back room. Several heads turned as a young man rushed out, apologizing profusely for the disturbance. Purbright's attention was immediately drawn to the ripple of unease that followed, a reminder that beneath the surface, tension was fraying nerves. As dusk fell, Purbright returned to his office, piecing together the fragments of the day. The carriage and its unknown driver, the undercurrents of old debts, the veiled fears, all were threads that wove a complex tapestry. The missing pearls had disturbed not only the Langleys, but the entire fabric of Flaxborough society. He poured himself a modest glass of whisky and settled into his chair, the quiet ticking of the clock marking the slow progress of time. He knew the path ahead required patience and a delicate touch, for in a town like Flaxborough, truths were often concealed behind the polite mask of civility. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the cobbles of Flaxborough's market square, as Inspector Purbright made his way toward the old vicarage, a place whispered about more for its faded grandeur than its current inhabitants. The case, which had begun with a simple theft, now revealed itself as a delicate dance of old grievances, secret debts, and the invisible fractures in a community long accustomed to its own quiet order. The vicarage, draped in creeping ivy and the faint scent of damp wood, was home to Reverend Jonathan Pierce, a man whose soft-spoken manner and unassuming presence belied a mind alert to the subtleties of human nature. Pierce greeted Purbright with a measured smile and a glint of knowing behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Inspector, I trust the town has been cooperative in your inquiries." "Cooperative, yes, but guarded," Purbright replied. "It seems the surface of Flaxborough conceals a labyrinth beneath." Pierce chuckled softly. "Indeed, the town is a tapestry of old wounds and delicate alliances. I have observed that where pearls are lost, other treasures are often at risk." Purbright inclined his head. "An apt metaphor. I understand you recently hosted a small gathering that included members of the Langley family?" "Yes," Pierce said, leading the inspector into a modest sitting room. It was an informal evening, intended to foster goodwill, yet, as is often the case, the shadows between words reveal more than the conversation itself. Purbright listened intently as Pierce recounted the evening, noting the subtle tensions, the careful choice of topics, and the fleeting glances exchanged. "Did anything in particular strike you as out of place?" "The arrival of a gentleman late in the evening," Pierce said. "A Mr. Ellery. His presence was unexpected, and his interest in the Langley pearls raised eyebrows. I gathered he had business reasons, but one must always read between the lines." "Do you know much about Mr. Ellery?" Purbright asked. "Only that he has connections beyond Flaxborough and a reputation for being both charming and persistent." The inspector made a mental note to pursue this Mr. Ellery further. The evening's gathering, innocent as it seemed, might have been a catalyst or a cover for something more. As Purbright stepped back into the street, the mist seemed thicker, muffling the sounds of the waking town. He made his way toward the station, where Sergeant Gibbs awaited with fresh reports and the ever-present scent of brewing tea. "Inspector," Gibbs greeted, "we've had a development." The carriage driver has been identified as one Mr. Samuel Kent, a travelling salesman with a somewhat dubious reputation. He claims to have been in Flaxborough on business, but his story is inconsistent. Purbright raised an eyebrow. In what way? Kent said he was here to sell fine textiles, yet no one seems to recall seeing his wares. Furthermore, he has a prior record for petty thefts in neighbouring counties. The inspector rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Have we located him? Currently he's at the Red Lion, though he's been elusive. Purbright resolved to visit the Red Lion that evening. If Mr. Kent was involved, direct observation might reveal the cracks in his tale. Meanwhile, the day unfolded with the slow inevitability of a well-rehearsed play. At the town's library, Purbright encountered Miss Edith Collingwood, the librarian, and a repository of local history and gossip. Her sharp eyes regarded him with quiet amusement. "Inspector, you seem to be chasing shadows and whispers." "Shadows often lead to light, Miss Collingwood," Purbright replied with a faint smile. "Have you heard anything about Mr. Ellery or this Samuel Kent?" Miss Collingwood nodded slowly. "Ellery is something of a mystery. He's been seen in several towns, always involved in business ventures that raise eyebrows. Kent, on the other hand, is known locally as a drifter, charming but slippery. Any connection between them? None that I can confirm, but where there's smoke, there's often fire." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion outside the library. Purbright stepped out to see a crowd gathered near the riverbank, murmurs swelling into a low hum of speculation. A body had been found, female, young, and unmistakably drowned. The victim was identified as Sarah Miller, a seamstress who had recently come to Flaxborough. The circumstances of her death were suspicious, no signs of struggle, but a faint trace of bruising on her wrist. Purbright's mind immediately raced. Could this be connected to the pearls, to the mysterious visitors, to the tensions festering beneath the town's polished exterior? At the scene, he observed the crowd carefully, noting the anxious glances, the whispered fears. Mrs. Maud Trent was among them, her usual composure shaken. "Inspector, this is terrible," she whispered. "Poor Sarah. She kept to herself mostly, but I heard she was worried, afraid of something or someone." Purbright nodded. Fear, like resentment, can be a powerful clue. Back at his office, the inspector laid out the threads: the missing pearls, the late visitor Mr. Ellery, the elusive Samuel Kent, and now the death of Sarah Miller. The case had expanded from a theft to something far darker, a tale of secrets and lies that threatened to engulf the town. He poured himself a cup of tea and settled in to plan his next moves. There would be more questions, more interviews, more quiet observations. In Flaxborough, as ever, truth was a delicate thing, often hidden beneath layers of civility and small-town pretense. The early autumn fog that wrapped Flaxborough in a damp embrace seemed to press inward, muffling sounds and softening edges, as though the town itself was reluctant to face the harsh truths that Inspector Purbright was gradually uncovering. The death of Sarah Miller had shifted the quiet rhythm of the market town. Where once polite conversation had filled the air, now there was a whispered tension, an undercurrent of suspicion and unease threading through the streets. Purbright found himself retracing the paths Sarah had walked, seeking the intangible traces left by her brief time in Flaxborough. His first visit that morning was to the modest lodging house where she had resided, the Crooked Lantern, a faded building with peeling paint and a persistent smell of damp linen. Madam Ada Whittaker, the proprietress, was a stout woman with sharp eyes and a mouth accustomed to managing both unruly tenants and delicate secrets. When Purbright entered, she was bustling about, wiping a brass lamp with the kind of care usually reserved for fragile heirlooms. "Inspector, I was expecting you," she said briskly. Poor Sarah. Quiet girl, but she had her troubles. What kind of troubles, Mrs. Whittaker? Purbright inquired gently. Ada paused, choosing her words with care. She'd been worried about a man, a stranger, who kept coming around asking questions. Sarah didn't say much, but she was jumpy. Said he had dark eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. Purbright nodded, filing away the description. Did she mention a name? No, sir, just the man. And the night she died? Did you hear anything unusual? Ada shook her head. No, but I did find her room disturbed the next morning, like she'd been packing in a hurry. Intrigued, Purbright asked to see Sarah's room. It was a small, plainly furnished space, dominated by a narrow bed and a battered wardrobe. On the floor, near the window, lay a small scrap of fabric caught on the sill, a thread of deep crimson, odd for a seamstress who preferred modest blues and greys. He bagged the fabric carefully, suspecting it might become a key piece of evidence. Leaving the crooked lantern, Purbright wandered toward the riverbank where Sarah's body had been found. The water was sluggish, reflecting the leaden sky, and the bank was strewn with fallen leaves, damp and slippery. At the edge, he encountered Constable Edwards, a young man with earnest eyes and a nervous demeanour. "Inspector, we've had some reports of strange noises near the old mill," Edwards said. "Folks say there's been late-night activity, footsteps, voices, but no one's dared investigate." Purbright's interest was piqued. The old mill, long out of use, was a crumbling relic of Flaxborough's past, an ideal place for clandestine meetings or shadowy dealings. "Have you been there yourself?" Edwards shook his head. "No, sir, but I thought it worth mentioning." "Thank you, Edwards. I'll take a look." As the morning wore on, Purbright paid a visit to Mr. Samuel Kent, the travelling salesman with a tarnished reputation. The Red Lion Inn was bustling with the midday crowd, the smell of ale and roasting meat filling the air. Kent was seated alone in a corner, nursing a pint and eyeing the room with guarded suspicion. When Purbright approached, the man's smile was oily, his handshake firm but calculated. "Inspector," Kent greeted, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Purbright took a seat opposite him. "Mr. Kent, your presence in Flaxborough on the night of the gala has drawn some attention. I'd like to hear your account." Sighed dramatically. "I was here on legitimate business, selling fine textiles. Unfortunately, the night's excitement has cast an unwelcome shadow." "Your wares were not seen by many," Purbright observed. "Do you have receipts or orders to substantiate your claims?" Kent's eyes flickered. "Business is not always conducted on paper, Inspector. Sometimes a handshake suffices." Purbright regarded him calmly. "And what of your previous run-ins with the law?" Kent shrugged. "Old mistakes. I'm trying to turn a new leaf." The inspector made a note to verify Kent's story further. Something about the man didn't sit right, but direct accusation was premature. Later that afternoon, Purbright sought out Emily Parsons, the young woman who had appeared anxious during the gala and whose name had surfaced in various whispered conversations. She was found in the garden behind the town's modest chapel, tending to a cluster of late-blooming chrysanthemums. "Miss Parsons," Purbright began gently, "I hope I'm not intruding." She looked up, her face pale but resolute. "Not at all, Inspector. I expect you have questions." "Indeed. I wonder if you could tell me more about your concerns regarding certain individuals at the gala?" Emily hesitated before speaking. "There are things people don't say aloud. Old debts, grievances, debts that go beyond money. Sarah Miller was afraid of someone. I think she found herself entangled in something beyond her control." "Did she confide in you directly?" "No, but she trusted me enough to hint at trouble. I wish I had pushed her to speak more." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Fear can be a silencer. Thank you, Miss Parsons." As evening approached, the inspector found himself back at the old mill. The place was a husk of broken timbers and rusting machinery, shadows pooling in corners like waiting secrets. He moved cautiously, ears straining against the silence. A sudden rustle from the underbrush startled him, and he caught sight of a figure slipping away, too quick for a clear look. The chase was brief, but fruitless. Returning to town, Purbright reflected on the day's revelations. The threads were weaving a complex tapestry: a frightened seamstress, a mysterious salesman, a reticent young woman, and a shadowy visitor whose intentions remained elusive. In Flaxborough, where the past clung as tightly as the morning mist, Inspector Purbright knew the truth was waiting in the spaces between words, in the silences and the sidelong glances. And he was patient. The evening air in Flaxborough had taken on the peculiar chill of early autumn, when the daylight slips away too quickly and shadows gather with unspoken purpose. Inspector Purbright found himself wandering the familiar yet ever-shifting streets with the careful deliberation of a man piecing together a delicate puzzle. Each step seemed to echo faintly against the cobblestones, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for some revelation to break the surface. Purbright's thoughts were tangled in the day's discoveries. Sarah Miller's death was no longer a simple tragedy. It had become the nexus of a web woven from whispered fears, hidden grudges, and carefully guarded secrets. The peculiar fabric scrap found in her room, the deep crimson thread, still clung to his mind, a vivid contrast to her modest attire and a silent clue awaiting illumination. The inspector's first stop was the Red Lion, the inn where Samuel Kent had taken refuge. The establishment was humming with its usual evening crowd, a medley of tired workers, gossipy locals, and the occasional traveller seeking warmth and ale. Kent was seated alone, nursing a drink as if it might steady his nerves. "Mr. Kent," Purbright greeted him softly, sliding into the seat opposite. "I hope I'm not interrupting your evening." Kent forced a smile, thin and brittle. "Not at all, Inspector. Please, what can I do for you?" "I wish to speak further about your activities the night of the town gala," Purbright began, folding his hands on the table. "There have been some inconsistencies in your account that I find troubling." Kent's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation passing across his face before politeness reclaimed its place. "I assure you, Inspector, my intentions have been entirely honest." Purbright inclined his head. "Honesty is a virtue, Mr. Kent, but it must be accompanied by evidence. I understand you had dealings with certain members of the Langley family." Kent sipped his drink slowly. "Business is business, Inspector. Some matters are best left unspoken. Yet silence can be deafening," Purbright murmured, watching the man carefully. "You appear to be quite familiar with Flaxborough's undercurrents." Kent smiled, but it lacked warmth. "One picks up knowledge over time." Before Purbright could press further, a commotion erupted near the bar, a loud voice, a crash, the sharp bark of a landlord admonishing a drunken patron. Kent took advantage of the distraction, rising abruptly. "I hope we can continue this conversation soon, Inspector." With that, he melted into the crowd, leaving Purbright with little more than a fading scent of expensive cologne and unanswered questions. The inspector's next appointment was with Mrs. Maud Trent, a woman whose social standing and sharp tongue made her both a repository and a source of the town's best gossip. She was ensconced in her drawing-room, a cup of tea balanced delicately in her hand, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. "Inspector," she greeted, "I trust you are making progress, though Flaxborough's secrets are as tangled as ever." "Indeed, Mrs. Trent," Purbright replied, taking the offered seat. I have been reflecting on the gala and the events surrounding it. It seems the town's calm veneer conceals quite a storm beneath. Mrs. Trent nodded sagely. You've seen the undercurrents, Inspector. The Langley pearls, the unexpected visitor, the seamstress's untimely demise. It's a cocktail of scandal and sorrow. Do you have any insights into Mr. Ellery? Purbright asked. Mrs. Trent's lips pursed. A man of charm and shadow, that one. His reputation in these parts is, complicated. He is said to have a talent for extracting what he desires, regardless of cost. Purbright made a mental note to investigate Ellery further. And the Langley family? How do they stand amidst these currents? A family proud yet fragile, Inspector. The pearls are more than mere jewels. They are a symbol of status, tradition, and unspoken debts. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Constable Edwards entered with a folded piece of paper. Inspector, you might find this interesting. A letter was found at the riverbank near where Miss Miller's body was recovered. Purbright took the letter, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, but hurried. Secrets buried in the past rise like ghosts. Beware the shadows where trust once lived. Mrs. Trent's eyes narrowed. A warning, perhaps. Or a confession, Purbright murmured. The inspector left Mrs. Trent's residence with the letter folded carefully in his pocket, the weight of its message settling on him like a damp cloak. As night deepened, Purbright found himself walking toward the old mill once more. The ruined structure loomed against the dark sky, skeletal and silent. The fog had thickened, muffling sounds and distorting shapes. His footsteps were measured, cautious. Suddenly a faint light flickered within the mill, a lantern swinging softly in the breeze. Purbright approached, his hand resting lightly on the revolver at his hip, more as reassurance than readiness. Inside, voices murmured, low, urgent. He crept forward, catching fragments of conversation. "I'll keep this quiet much longer," a gruff voice said. "But the pearls, the debt, it's all connected," another whispered. Purbright stepped into the faint glow, clearing his throat gently. "Gentlemen, I believe a discussion involving the Langley pearls and debts is of great interest to me." Two men turned sharply. One was Mr. Ellery, his face partially obscured by shadow. The other, a local businessman known for his financial entanglements, Mr. Harold Fenn. "Inspector Purbright," Ellery said smoothly, recovering first. "We were merely discussing town affairs." Purbright's gaze was steady. "Indeed, and yet these affairs seem to involve threats, debts, and perhaps more serious matters." Fenn's jaw tightened. "We are entitled to some privacy." "As are you entitled to the law's scrutiny," Purbright replied evenly. "Especially when a life has been lost and jewels have vanished." The men exchanged glances, the tension thickening. Purbright pressed on. "Mr. Ellery, your presence at the vicarage gala and your dealings with the Langleys have been noted. Mr. Fenn, your financial interests in the town are well known. I suggest cooperation would be preferable to obfuscation." Ellery smiled thinly. "Cooperation is a charming idea, Inspector. We'll see if it's practical." Purbright stepped closer. "The crimson thread found in Miss Miller's room, does it mean anything to you?" Both men paled slightly. Ellery's gaze flickered away first, and Fenn's clenched fists betrayed his composure. The inspector pressed his advantage. "I intend to unravel this, gentlemen. Your choice is to assist or to complicate matters." The men remained silent. Purbright withdrew, leaving them to ponder their options. Back at his office, he laid out the accumulating evidence, the letter, the crimson thread, the tangled relationships. The case was coming into sharper focus, but the final piece still eluded him. In Flaxborough, Beneath the genteel façades and the polite smiles, the truth waited patiently for the right moment to emerge. The morning air in Flaxborough was crisp and bright, the sort of clarity that promised revelation, or at least the promise of it. Inspector Purbright arrived at his modest office, its walls lined with yellowing case files and fading photographs that bore silent witness to the town's accumulated secrets. Today, he intended to unravel those secrets, slowly, methodically, with the quiet precision that had become his hallmark. His first visitor was Miss Emily Parsons, who had agreed to meet him at the small cafe opposite the station. She arrived punctually, looking more composed than on their previous encounter, though her eyes retained that shadow of unease. "Thank you for coming, Miss Parsons," Purbright began with his usual politeness. "There are still many questions to answer." Emily nodded. "I feel I should tell you everything I know, even if it might be uncomfortable." Purbright smiled gently. "Truth often is, Miss Parsons, but it is the only path to peace." She took a deep breath and recounted the recent events as she had witnessed them, filling in gaps and clarifying motives. Sarah Miller's fear, the mysterious visitor, the tensions surrounding the Langley pearls, all pieces slowly knitting themselves together in the inspector's mind. As their conversation drew to a close, Purbright mentioned the crimson thread. Emily's expression flickered. "I remember Sarah mentioning a new cloak she'd acquired, a deep red, silk-lined cloak. She seemed proud of it, but worried about it being noticed." "Did she say from whom she obtained it?" Purbright asked. Emily hesitated. "No, but there was a name," she whispered once. "Mrs. Whittaker." The pieces began to click. Back at the Crooked Lantern, Purbright sought out Madame Ada Whittaker again. The stout woman was polishing silverware when the inspector arrived, her expression guarded. "Mrs. Whittaker, I wonder if you might shed some light on a certain cloak belonging to Miss Miller?" Ada's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't see how I can help, Inspector." "Not long ago, Miss Miller mentioned receiving a red cloak, silk-lined, did she not?" Ada's lip twitched. "She did. It was a gift from an admirer, I believe." "Do you know who this admirer might be?" Ada sighed, then glanced around as if to ensure no ears were listening. "It was Mr. Ellery. He fancied himself quite the romantic." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "And did Miss Miller accept this gift willingly?" Ada hesitated. "She was flattered, but cautious. She said it made her stand out in ways she hadn't wanted." This revelation deepened the mystery. The crimson thread was not a random fragment, but a piece of a garment tied directly to a man whose motives were far from transparent. Later that afternoon, Purbright arranged a discreet meeting with Mr. Ellery at the town's boating pond, a quiet spot favoured for its tranquillity. Ellery arrived, impeccably dressed, his charm polished to a fine gleam. "Inspector, to what do I owe this pleasure?" he inquired smoothly. Purbright regarded him steadily. "Mr. Ellery, I wish to discuss the gift you gave to Miss Miller, the red cloak." Ellery smiled thinly. "A token of admiration, nothing more." Yet Miss Miller seemed wary, even fearful. Ellery's eyes flickered briefly but recovered. "People often misinterpret kindness," Purbright pressed on. "You were seen near the old mill the night of the gala. Care to explain?" Ellery's smile faltered. "I was taking a solitary walk, nothing nefarious." The inspector did not reply immediately, allowing the silence to settle heavily between them. "Mr. Ellery, do you know what became of the pearls that went missing?" Ellery's face tightened imperceptibly. "I heard rumours, but know nothing." Purbright's gaze hardened. "Rumours that implicate you?" Ellery stepped back, smoothing his coat. "I think you have your suspicions, Inspector. Perhaps you should follow them." As Ellery turned to leave, Purbright called after him. "One more thing, Mr. Ellery. The letter found near the riverbank. Did you write it?" Ellery paused, then shook his head. "No, Inspector. But it's a fitting sentiment." With that, he departed, leaving Purbright alone with the swirling fog of half-truths. The final clue came unexpectedly that evening. While reviewing notes, Purbright found a mention of a local tailor, Mr. Charles Fenwick, who had recently repaired a silk cloak matching the description. Purbright paid a visit the next morning to Fenwick's modest shop on Market Street. Fenwick was a man of small stature, with twitchy fingers and an anxious expression that belied his profession. "Mr. Fenwick, I'm investigating the cloak worn by Miss Miller," Purbright explained. "It seems you performed some repairs recently." Fenwick swallowed hard. "Yes, Inspector, it came from Mr. Ellery." "Was there anything unusual about the cloak's condition?" Fenwick nodded. "There was a tear, but more odd was the small piece of fabric sewn inside. A hidden pocket." Purbright leaned in. "A hidden pocket. Very small, but enough to conceal something thin and flat. I was asked to keep it secret." The inspector's mind raced. The pearls, the cloak, the hidden pocket, an ingenious method of concealment. Returning to his office, Purbright assembled the suspects, the threads converging at last. He arranged a polite meeting at the town hall, inviting Mr. Ellery, Madam Whitaker, Mrs. Trent, and Mr. Kent. The atmosphere was formal, charged with a tension that no one chose to name outright. Purbright began calmly, detailing the sequence of events, the concealed cloak, the missing pearls, and the secrets each person harbored. One by one, he unveiled their connections to the crime, careful not to accuse, but to illuminate. It became clear that Ellery had orchestrated a delicate scheme, using the cloak's hidden pocket to smuggle the pearls while manipulating others to cover his tracks. Faced with the evidence and Purbright's unflappable demeanor, Ellery's composure crumbled. He confessed to the theft, explaining his financial desperation and misguided attempts to secure a future by leveraging the Langley family's wealth. The room fell silent as the weight of the truth settled. Purbright's voice softened. "Crime in Flaxborough, as elsewhere, often wears a quiet face, woven from fear, pride, and folly. Let this be a reminder that beneath the surface, the town's pulse beats with complexities not always visible." With the matter resolved, the town slowly exhaled. Gossip would ripple, reputations would adjust, but life in Flaxborough would continue, its surface calm, yet subtly altered. Back at his desk, Purbright resumed his quiet paperwork. The case closed, but the town's enigmas, far from exhausted,